At the Wiener Holocaust Library in central London, a new exhibition tells the troubling story of eugenics, a set of ideas that cast a terrible shadow over the 20th century and beyond. It's the work of historian Marius Turda. He's given us a very personal tour of this powerful exhibition.
What we're celebrating today is not an achievement in the history of science, but rather a moment of reckoning. This exhibition, which is entitled We Are Not Alone, Legacies of Eugenics, coincides with a century of the Second International Congress of Eugenics, which was organized in 1921 in New York at the American Museum of Natural History. And we thought it would be appropriate to show the general public what it means a century since this Congress, how eugenics influenced our lives, the impact it had on various policies across the world, and to really prompt them to think what eugenics means today. As you can see here, we started with the beginning. We looked at the British context first. We looked at Francis Galton, the British scientist who coined the term eugenics in 1883. And he was a very important scientist in his day. And he worked extensively on a number of issues, but eugenics was something that he was particularly attracted to. Galton defined eugenics very simply. He used the Greek term well-born, and then in 1883 he produced his definition, which is basically eugenics is the science that deals with the improvement of the racial qualities of the race. Or as he put it here, the study of agencies under social control, they may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. And here we have some of the important followers and collaborators of Francis Galton, and how indeed the movement grew and gained impetus, and then it expanded globally. So I also included the first International Eugenic Congress, which happened in London in 1912. Galton dies in 1911, a year earlier. So by then, eugenics is truly a global phenomenon. The Eugenic Congress was attended by political figures such as Winston Churchill, scientific celebrities such as Alexander Graham Bell. It was truly an important moment for the British eugenics, and particularly for the British Eugenics Society. At the time, it was called Eugenics Education Society, which was founded in 1907. Then we look at a very important piece, which is on display for the first time, which is this genealogical tree, showing the connection and the pedigree of Charles Darwin and Francis Galton, two important families throughout history, going all the way back to the Carolingians, so Charlemagne. This is a very important piece, and I'm very happy we're able to include it in the exhibition. It's something that people always get very drawn to it. But what also indicates, is very interesting, it shows how eugenicists were so obsessed with establishing genealogies and illustrious pedigrees of people they considered to be superior or considered to be important. So you have a scientist such as Charles Darwin. It was only appropriate, I suppose, to illustrate that he belonged to a very important line of people.
This 1937 film illustrates the eugenicist fascination with family trees.
Eugenics seeks to apply the known laws of heredity so as to prevent the degeneration of the race and improve its inborn qualities. An example of favourable heredity is shown by the pedigree of the Phelps family, members of which have been boatmen on the Thames for generations. 9 members of this family have won the race for the famous Doggett coat and badge. On this diagram, the 9 winners are shown in white.
Marriage, family, and children. Well, one of the topics eugenicists were very keen to talk about, and they insisted that the family, the protection of the family, the well-being of future generations, and the protection of children, and the rearing of children, the proper education of children, and so on, so forth. It's something that eugenics can contribute to. Eugenicists can help educate people about what is the proper way to get married, What is the proper way to choose a spouse? Which are the things you need to take into account to make the right decision? And then accordingly, how to decide and think carefully about having a family and having children. So these were very important topics which continue to these days. We still have debates about who we should marry. Should we marry outside our group? Is it okay to marry someone of a different religion or different race? What are the consequences of your actions if you do that? Do you think of your children when you do that? So these are topics which were extremely important then, as they are now. And eugenicists were very keen to capitalize on the public interest in these issues, because of course the public was interested. The eugenicists could feed into that. Eugenicists realized from the very beginning they need to popularize, to spread their ideas to the general public. So they could do this through a number of venues. They could popularize it in the popular culture, in the newspapers. They could do it at the exhibitions. They could do it at fairs. They could also do it in the school. So there was a concerted attempt by the eugenic societies, not only in this country but across the world, to introduce eugenic educations in the curriculum, in the school curriculum. So educate the teachers how to best engage with their pupils and their students and how they can be taught in the basic knowledge of heredity and eugenics. So here we have some examples from Britain, very, very important educators who were members of the Eugenic Society. They were principals of various schools across the country. They came to the conferences organized by the Eugenic Societies. They tried to engage with the science of heredity and the eugenic ideas of educating the youth, controlling in a way the possibility of improving them through education and social uplifting. It was argued that the school is crucially important in fostering the responsibility of parenthood. We're going to teach young girls and young boys how to behave responsibly towards society, towards themselves. Sexual education was very important. So some of these eugenicists and feminists who endorsed eugenics were very keen to go to girls' schools and teach them about venereal diseases, about contraception, about modern ideas of hygiene, which they assume are crucially important in building a modern woman, but at the same time would give you the necessary tools to make an informed decision about your sexual life and then about the appropriate partner. So you could see how it worked across the board. So you would have people talking about morality, talking about education. Other peoples would talk about the importance of fostering strong citizens. The school is there to create the proper members of the race, important for the future of the country, for the future of the empire. So the school worked on so many levels, ideological, eugenical, but at the same time, and very importantly, of course, educational. So eugenicists were able to intersect with all these levels and put across their message. But of course, there was also a big discussion within education about what do we do with those children who are lagging behind. The big debate about feeble-minded people, about children who are allegedly less prepared to enter a normal education. So you have what we can call, if you wish, positive education in relation to eugenics, how we can help people develop their already endowed with skills or acquired skills, and then what do we do with those who don't possess enough intelligence?
Here is a man who, although normal, comes from a mentally defective family. Here is his wife, who is also normal. They have had 17 children. Let us examine the pedigree of these children. 5 of them died in infancy. 3 are still too young for an opinion to be formed of their mental state, a boy and 2 girls. Only 2 of the remaining children are normal, a man and a girl. The remaining 7 children are all mental defectives, marked on the pedigree in black.
So then the big discussion, of course, moved from education in schools to the special schools, right? What do we put those children? How do we deal with them? What do we teach them? They're still beneficial to society. So this big debate about feeble-mindedness, but that was one of the topics that the English and the American eugenicists were very interested in, and they produced a great deal of material. They succeeded in 1913 to push forward publicly and politically the debate about mental deficiencies. A Royal Commission was established in 1904. They published their results in 1908. Eugenicists such as Francis Galton participated in the debate, in the public debate about mental deficiencies. And of course, it was believed that we need to separate feeble-minded people, as they were called at the time, from the rest of society. It was also, of course, wrongly assumed that by bringing this under control, issues such as poverty, illegitimacy, prostitution would be brought under control. So there was a very important social message behind it. It was assumed, of course, that people with mental deficiencies or mental disabilities are the culprit of much of the social problems in Britain at the time. So they really produced a great deal of work trying to persuade the public as well of the importance and of the legitimacy of putting people away, putting them in care and institutionalizing them.
In institutions such as this, all over the country, mental defectives are cared for. These are children who are helpless in every way and need constant attention. Once such children have been born, we must do the best we can for them, who can only be educated up to the point of normal children of 7 to 10.
This also happened in America, of course, and then it grew and it became a very accepted way of dealing with people with disabilities, just try to put them away. So this happens, in the 1910s, 1920s, that's early 20th century. Of course, things will escalate as we move into 1920s and 30s, when more radical solutions were looked at, particularly sterilization. And then, of course, with the emergence of Nazism in Germany, then we have laws which are trying to, if not reduce the number of people with disabilities, they couldn't reduce them, then they looked at elimination. From Britain, eugenics traveled fast and wide. In the United States, it became a very popular movement. You have organizations being established, journals being published, and indeed some very prominent scientists endorsing eugenics. Now, we also know that the world's first eugenics sterilization law was introduced in Indiana in 1907, establishing a long tradition of punitive practices. And the American eugenics really becomes globally relevant because they organized the second and the third International Congress, respectively, in New York in 1921 and 1932.
The eugenics movement had influence across the globe. But it was in Germany that it reached its horrifying conclusion.
German racial hygiene movement, as it was called, German eugenic movement, develops early on. By 1895, you have very important books published by authors such as Alfred Ploetz. And German eugenicists are very keen to play with the word race and the protection of the race. Some of them are very radical. They endorse ideas of Nordicism, the superiority of the white race, similar to the Americans. Others are particularly feminists and eugenicists on the left, are very critical of racism, yet they still endorse eugenics. They still see it as an important progressive social movement that could help society. But by 1920s, of course, things come to a very interesting synthesis, which the Nazi regime is able to orchestrate. And then by July 1933, they introduce the famous sterilization law, or as they call it, the law for the prevention of the birth of those with hereditary defects. And we have a poster here, and that connects to the poster of the exhibition. That's a very interesting argument they put forward. So Nazi propagandists were distributing this image. They were saying, we are not alone. We are not the only ones trying to get rid of defectives in our society. It's been done in America, and it's being planned in countries such as Britain and Poland and Japan. So they really believe themselves to be, in a global movement. And they were, of course, the vanguard of that particular movement, because they were the first ones to really take this and make it a political program. It was adopted by the state. Eugenics becomes an integral part of the Nazi idea of recreating the national community and the race. So the Nazis look at eugenics as the way forward of creating the perfect society, but also interestingly, and here is the interplay that we created in this exhibition, they believed that they were just doing what everyone else was doing or was about to be doing. So that's, I think, quite important when it comes to the next panel, where we look at internationalization. So basically, there are very few countries which have been touched by eugenics during the first half of the 20th century. Eugenic societies existed absolutely everywhere. And here we have some examples from the Saxon physician in Transylvania in 1900s, who was a very keen promoter of eugenics and fighting for the Germans in Transylvania along racial lines. He became a member of the German Society for Racial Hygiene, worked very closely with Alfred Plutz. So we have something like him. We look at the Czech, we look at Italians, we look at the Swedes, we look at the Hungarians, Brazilians, Mexicans. So truly global. We have eugenic societies established in Central and South Africa. You have eugenic societies in South America. You have eugenic societies in Eastern Europe. So it's truly a global phenomenon. And then, bringing the exhibition to an end, I wanted to highlight two important aspects of it, which I think are still little known. One is how eugenics managed to be so successful, right? The support it received from scientists, the endorsement it received from important institutions. We mentioned some very important names here. And I continue this by looking at some of them across the world, particularly in Britain and America. Very important geneticists, very important population experts, very important statisticians. And I give some examples here of how ultimately eugenics was able to influence so much of our national and social and educational policies because it was bolstered, prompted by scientific research, pouring out of universities, state agencies, institutes of research, and very important scientists endorsed it. So that's something I want to highlight, and I call that the experts. We shouldn't forget, eugenics is unfounded and based on very unsound scientific arguments. But this is not to say that it wasn't taken seriously by scientists, and scientists did try very hard to provide scientific explanations and scientific credibility to eugenics. And then we look at actually those people who are affected by eugenics. We're looking at the victims. And this is, I think, extremely important. We shouldn't forget, these are not nameless people. Hundreds of thousands of people have suffered as a result of these policies across the world. So to bring the voice of the victim, I think, is extremely important. And we have some examples here, really cutting across. America in the 1920s. We have Nazi Germany. We have, again, America in the 1950s. Very few people know that many of these programs continued in the 1950s and 60s. But also racial research done on indigenous people, as it happens with the Sami people in Scandinavia. Of course, what happened with the Roma people in Europe. And then I bring this conversation, of course, to the 1950s, where some of these ideas, of course, became problematic, and the word eugenics was abandoned in many ways. However, the practice continued. We could see this happening not only in America, but also in the Scandinavian countries. Sterilization programs continued in Sweden, Iceland, and Finland until the 1970s. In Iceland, if I can use this example, the sterilization law was in force from 1935, I think, until 1975. They sterilized 120 people, but their population was only 200,000 people. So even a small country such as Iceland still had a very strong eugenic movement. And people don't know about that, and we need to bring forward the voice of those who suffered. And this brings me to the last panel of the exhibition, which is about confronting eugenics. The exhibition tries not only to engage historically with the topic and to allow visitors to understand some of the complex history of eugenics, but more importantly, to be able to use that knowledge, to use the historical knowledge to confront eugenics, to call it out when you see it in today's society.
Leilani Muir was sterilised in 1955. She was 11 years old. 40 years later, she successfully sued the Alberta government for her wrongful sterilisation.
We are now living in a period when we need to be more actively involved with unmasking these hidden histories of eugenics. And we need to come to terms with a past which is very problematic, it's very difficult to talk about. However, we need to move this conversation forward. So we need to be able to look at the history and learn from it. This will, in the end, allow the stories of those women and men who were wronged in the name of eugenics to be known, their voices to be heard.